2018 begins with a new world of taxation thanks to the just-passed tax reform, whose detractors call it a gift to the rich, whose supporters see it as the starting point for a new era of spreading prosperity. Well, which is it? Our first resolution, the GOP tax reform bill, now law, will improve our outlook for growth. Our first debater is Simon Johnson. On this resolution, the GOP tax reform bill will improve our outlook for growth. Do you declare yes or no?
No.
You have 90 seconds to make your argument.
John, I think that the way to think about this tax cut, I think the word reform is somewhat overused in this context. This tax cut is focused on old capital. There's two kinds of capital in this economy. There's new capital, there's new investment. That's what builds companies, that's what builds jobs. I'm a professor of entrepreneurship at MIT. I work with entrepreneurs all the time. They are unimpressed by this tax cut. Gary Cohn, who is a senior economic advisor to Donald Trump, spoke to a group recently, a group like this, and asked them how many, this kind of numbers, a group of CEOs, asked them how many of them are going to increase their investment and create new jobs as a result of the tax cut. Very few of them raised their hand, and he was shocked. But the reason is this GOP Republican tax cut is focused on old capital. If you own a building, for example, a large building with a lot of apartments in New York City, should you be so lucky, then you're going to do very well from this tax cut. That's old capital. That's capital that's already in place. The new capital, the capital that builds companies, the capital, the support that we get for research and development, that is not going up. I think that's going to get actually squeezed when you take the entire tax picture. And when you consider, John, all of the issues here, including the distributional impact, including the incentives to ordinary working people to go to college, to get more education, to invest in themselves in order to participate with new capital as partners in economic growth, this tax reform, at best, is a zero. I think it could be somewhat negative. If you own a building around the corner or down by Central Park, congratulations.
We move on to Jason Furman. Jason Furman, on the resolution, the GOP tax reform bill will improve our outlook for growth. Do you declare yes or no?
John, I declare no. Let me get out of the way. This tax cut's going to shovel $200 billion into the economy this year. That will help the economy this year by a small amount and a transitory amount. What it won't do is improve our outlook for long-run growth. Simon got to the very core reason for that. It's a windfall for investments people have already made. It's not very much of an incentive for new investments. The United States already had a very high corporate tax rate, but also had a lot of loopholes. And that meant that the effective corporate tax rate wasn't actually very high. In fact, under this bill, the tax rate on research and development will go up. And so we're going to have less innovation and less research. In addition to that, this tax bill will balloon the deficit. The deficit next year will be more than $1 trillion. It will stay more than $1 trillion going forward. We've had large deficits before when fighting wars, in very deep recessions. We have never, ever had a deficit anything like this as a share of the economy in peacetime. So whatever benefits you get from the rate reductions will be more than outweighed by the deficit reduction. The last thing I'd say is this isn't just my judgment. This is the judgment of the FOMC, which hasn't changed its long-run outlook. None of the major investment banks have. A survey of 42 economists, 0 of them said it would have a large impact on long-run growth because they all understood it's a benefit for old capital that will swell the deficit and cost us in terms of research.
The resolution, the GOP tax reform bill, will improve our outlook for growth. Gillian Tett, how do you declare?
Well, I'm going to declare yes, partly because I want to make this debate a bit more interesting, but also because...
We so appreciate that.
But also because I'd like to shift the perspective. As it happens, if you look at the long run, I share many of the concerns that Jason and Simon have raised. I think many aspects of the tax bill are not desirable. It is indeed very slanted towards, as Simon says, making American real estate great again, particularly in New York. However, I would also like to say that in the short term, there are benefits coming down this year. I do think it has helped to ignite animal spirits. And as someone who did indeed train as a cultural anthropologist, not an economist, as somebody who's in the information game and spent a lot of time as a journalist overseeing a newspaper looking at sentiment, I actually think that Sentiment matters a lot. This has helped to ignite animal spirits. It has also helped to create a sense of optimism, and there's also a sense of narrative around what's going on with the economy. There hasn't been a sense of clear-cut narrative for a long time. So for all those reasons, I do actually think that in the short to medium term, it's already delivering a boost. However, I do share the concerns that they have echoed about the long term. So that's a kind of qualified yes, at least to inject a bit more debate and dynamism into this debate, and I'm sure the next speaker will have a thorough yes.
Thank you, Gillian Tett. That next speaker is Stephen Moore. Stephen, on the resolution, the GOP tax reform bill will improve our outlook for growth. Are you yes or no?
I'm going to say no. No, I'm only kidding. I'm only kidding. I helped write the bill, so of course I'm a yes. Look, I think that that giant sucking sound you're hearing is the United States is sucking capital from the rest of the world. I agree with these two gentlemen that capital is the name of the game. Whoever has the most capital wins. We have made dramatic improvements in our global competitive situation. When we started writing this bill 2 years ago, the whole idea was how do we make American businesses more competitive? I do believe that our highest in the world corporate tax rate was one of the dumbest things in the world. It was a Head Start program for all the countries that we compete with. We've fixed that big time. We've gone from the highest statutory tax rate in the world to below the average. That's going to bring a lot of jobs and factories back to the United States. We did the repatriation, so companies can bring, we don't know how much, $1 or $2 trillion back to the United States. That's a huge benefit in terms of money being invested here in America rather than being invested in India or China or Mexico or other countries. We also reduced the small business tax rate. So right now, as of prior to January 1st, the highest tax rate on small businesses was 40%. It's now down to 30%. There's an old saying, when you tax something, you get less of it. When you tax something less, you get more of it. We're going to see a lot more jobs. We're going to see a lot more investment. And I think that confidence that you talked about, which I agree with, that optimism is in no small part a result of this tax bill.
Thank you, Stephen Moore. Dambisa Moyo, on the resolution, the GOP tax reform bill will improve our outlook for growth. Yes or no?
I'm going to go with no. Of course, one of the problems with being the last speaker is that a lot of the comments have been made, but perhaps let me just underscore what I think is a lot of smoke and mirrors with short-term focus, which is driven really by a political cycle that actually rewards and encourages people to focus on the short term. If you focus on the short term as a household or as a corporate, you are missing the broader point. The future generations are going to grappling or will grapple with a tremendous suite of challenges. Many of them we're fully aware of. What I'd like to do very quickly is just list for you, and I'm sure in a little bit later I'll be able to go in great detail, some of the challenges that we're facing today. Technology and the jobless underclass, the risks of income inequality widening, the fact that demographics are growing at rapid clip around the world. We have 8 billion people, will be 11 billion people by 2100, and we don't know how to manage that population. Issues around natural resource scarcity, concerns around debt, which were alluded to earlier. It's burdensome, and it's not helping us in long term in terms of how we generate long-term economic growth. And then finally, the fact that productivity has declined in many of the most developed countries around the world. It's this suite of problems that are continuing to be a drag on long-term economic growth. And if you believe that a short-term tax is going to actually solve these problems or actually meaningfully turn things around, you're sadly mistaken.
Thank you, Dambisa Moyo. And now we talk for 10 minutes, and it's much more free form, and we're going to go a little bit more into depth on the things we are just hearing about. Some interesting phrases coming up: ballooning the deficit. I really liked ignite animal spirits. We heard about smoke and mirrors. What I want to do is we have 3 no's and 2 yeses. And I think an interesting thing about this format is that all of the people who are saying no are not actually saying no for precisely the same reasons, and the yeses are not yeses for the same reason. So that allows for a little bit more nuance in this conversation. But a thing that I kept hearing about was the long-term versus short-term impact of this. And Jason Furman, you talked about the deficit being ballooned, and I didn't think that Stephen Moore responded to that, and I kind of would like Stephen to for you to respond to the concern that many of your co-panelists raised that not in the not too distant future, there's going to be hell to pay for this tax plan. Can you take that on? And again, in the interest of getting everybody in, to be kind of as terse as you can.
So I'm of the view, and I don't know if Donald Trump agrees with this, but that growth is everything. That growth solves all the problems, and the very problems that you're talking about. It may not solve every problem you're talking about, but if you have faster economic growth and prosperity, it makes all these problems easier to solve. And the deficit is Exhibit A on this. The forecast when Donald Trump entered office was we continue to have weak economic growth as we did for the last 10 years. It was 1.8% growth forecast. We went to Donald Trump and said, Donald, if we get 1.8% growth for the next 10 or 20 years, we're screwed. We're America, we can't live with 1.8%. We've got to get it up to 3 to 4%. I believe we're going to do that with this bill. I think we already have had 3% growth, and the debt as a share of our economy does not go up every year, it goes down every year if we can get to 3 to 3.5% growth. And that would be my kind of response to this issue that you both raised about debt.
Can you respond back to that?
Sure. First of all, we have to understand the sources of our growth. The primary source of our slower growth than we had in the past is demography. In the 1980s, the baby boom generation was going through their prime working years. Starting in 2008, the first baby boomers turned 62 and started to retire as they became eligible for Social Security. If we were able to reproduce the same exact productivity growth that we had under President Reagan, under today's demography, we would have a 1.7% growth rate. Thinking you can have a 3 or 4% growth rate is a ludicrous fantasy. If a company did that, it would go bankrupt and out of business. The United States is a big, strong, able to borrow quite a lot, but I wouldn't want to test the proposition of what it would be like to base it on. The second thing I'd say is to say that this tax cut pays for itself is to make a statement that has zero support in the economics profession. It's akin to saying
Let me stop you
the
on
earth
that
is
and
flat.
let Julian respond. Is a yes, do you dispute that point?
No, I was going to say one thing about the other way to get around big, rapid growth is to have lots of migration. If you don't have lots of babies, you can have lots of migration. And that policy is not exactly on the table right now.
Especially if you come from S-hole countries like I do.
Exactly.
Oh, I'm sorry. I meant house.
But thank you for the abbreviation, because now we can stay on the radio.
Exactly. I had one point to make about the debt, which is the other aspect about debt that people just are not talking about at the moment is that the only reason why debt has been moderately manageable recently is because interest rates have been incredibly low. If you believe that there is going to be growth of the sort that you're arguing there's going to be, then interest rates will almost certainly go up. And if interest rates go up, if they go from 1.8% to 3%, say, you're basically looking at a doubling of the annual cost of the servicing that debt. Anyone in the room who's got credit card debt or mortgages knows how it works. Mm-hmm. And so there's a fundamental intellectual contradiction. If you think that there's going to be great growth, rates go up, and then the cost of servicing that debt gets harder and harder.
Simon Johnson.
So just to develop that point, animal spirits, Gillian rightly emphasizes, come in two forms. One is let's invest, and we may see that in stock prices. There's also animal spirits in the bond market. So what does the bond market say? The bond market is worried about inflation for exactly these reasons. When the bond market worries about inflation, interest rates go up, and that's pressure on Steve. I hope you're right, Stephen, because then we're all going to live better. But I fear you're up against the same economic realities, the same constraints as we've all been up against. And by the way, the Obama administration broke 3%, in fact, broke 4% growth for at least 2 quarters, I think, in 2014. Quarterly growth tells you nothing. The long-run growth, that's what we're talking about, is exactly as Jason said, is driven by demographics, and the budget is going to matter. The debt is eventually going to catch up with us.
Tambisa Moyo, you made the point that the set of real problems are way larger and much more complicated than a tax cut can address. Have you heard anything from the people on the other side of this resolution tonight who have made a persuasive case to the contrary?
Not at all. And I think just picking up on the demographic point, just to underscore how difficult and how challenging this is in the US context, we need to think about not just the quantity of people in the workforce, but also the quality of the people in the workforce. You don't have to believe me. Go and look at the OECD PISA statistics. This is a survey that the OECD, which is a club of wealthy advanced countries around the world, that basically looks at how these countries are forecasted to grow grow over long periods of time. They have an annual survey, the PISA survey, that looks at how young people perform in mathematics, in science, and in reading. The United States, 10 years ago, was in the top 3. Today, it's ranked in nearly number 30 around the world. This is not an investment, this has not been an investment, particularly in minority groups, who will be the majority in this country by 2050, by some estimates. And you cannot have a country long-term that is expected to be successful just because you have a short-term tax cut when you have underinvested in a population that you expect is going to contribute to long-term economic growth.
Let me bring your point then to Stephen Moore. Stephen, again, Stephen, does this tax cut actually do something to ameliorate the challenges that Dambisa is just speaking about?
Well, which challenge are you talking about? I mean, in particular,
The applause line just then.
I am of the belief that we are at the beginning of a productivity revolution. That we could see the greatest period of productivity in history. I mean, we're seeing it in automation, we're seeing it in robotics, and that is part of I think, the explanation about how you get to higher growth. I think you're going to see, dramatic rates of increase in productivity. Productivity is related to capital investment. Now, of course, we need more human capital investment, no question about it. And the other point I would make, and this is where I probably disagree with Donald Trump, look, we can have an increase in our labor force. There are 7 million Americans who would be and should be working but aren't working because we've seen a decline in our labor force participation. We've got to find ways to drive those people back into the workforce. But also, I mean, you hinted at this. We have an opportunity now to attract the best and the brightest and the smartest people from all over the world to the United States. Donald Trump, I think quite correctly, wants to move us towards a merit-based immigration system where we can get, the people who have the highest skills, highest talents, the people who have excellence in whatever area it is. That gives us a great advantage to achieve this high rate of growth.
Let me bring Jason in and then Jillian to finish this section.
I mean, first of all, I think it...
All right, you can wait. Let him have his moment.
Yeah,
I stepped on Stephen's applause, sorry.
On Dambisa's point, I mean, how you're going to address an issue like preschool, where the United States is 22nd out of those OECD rich countries, behind some less than fully rich countries like Mexico and Chile that have gotten into the club without having adequate resources. It's not something we can do. I wanted to get back to the animal spirits question, because that's going to come up in this session. I'll bet the next one as well. Animal spirits, first of all, they're not self-sustaining. They can help you for a bit, but then if they're not justified by real activity, they can send you crashing back down. They're a little bit dangerous. Second of all, I'm not so sure how much of them we do have in the United States. John, I don't know what you invest in. Maybe you invested in U.S. equities over the last year. If you did pretty well in the U.S. stock market. You would have done even better in the UK stock market, the German stock market, the French stock market, the Canadian stock market, the Japanese stock market. U.S. growth this year came in faster than anyone expected, which is a great thing. Came in 0.4 higher than what the IMF was projecting. Germany, France, the UK, Canada, Japan, they all came in 0.6, 0.8, 1.1 higher.
Jason,
so you've seen a lot more animal spirits in the global economy. To say it's all due to a tax cut here in the United States, I think is...
Thank you. I wanted you to circle it back to that tax question. And I'm going to give the last word on this section to Jillian Tett.
I just want to come to this issue of animal spirits again, because I have enormous...
Define it for us, what you mean by that.
It basically means how you feel, and if you get excited, you want to rush out and buy a new car, a new jacuzzi, whatever else, start investing, that kind of stuff. And I have great respect for economists and their wonderful models and all their numbers and all their data, but at the end of the day, most of us live economics through not just our wallet, but through stories. And I strongly believe that one reason why the Democrats lost the last election was they had no clear-cut story. Trump, for better or worse, had a story that he could tweet out, if you like. And I do think when I talk to business leaders today that what is going on in their minds is a story about American growth coming back onto the radar screen. When I talk to households, when I talk to people who are not grown-up economists sitting in debates like this, there's a sense that actually the story is changing. And you might disagree with that. You might say the data doesn't back that up. You might say they're going to be disappointed. But right now, if you look not just at the stock market, if you look at polls of consumer confidence and corporate confidence, it has risen dramatically. And that is a story that really matters.
Thank you, Gillian Tett. And that is a wrap on this resolution. The GOP tax reform bill will improve our outlook for growth.